good morning, good evening. Happy that you are all joining us for this very important and timely J-stream about Israel's democracy in crisis and the latest developments since Monday. My name is Adina Vogel-Ayalon, and I am J Street's Chief of Staff, and we are joined by Noa Landau from Haaretz and Professor Tamar Hostovsky Brandes, who is from the Law Professors Forum for Democracy, as well as a senior lecturer at the College of Law faculty at Ono Academic College. I will touch a little bit more on both of their bios, but I just want to start by saying thank you to both of you for making the time to join us for this very, very important webinar. I know that you are both incredibly busy individuals, especially now, and we do not take for granted, all of us in our movement do not take for granted the fact that you have taken the time to be here and to help us understand the significance of this moment. So I will just start with a little bit of a background before I turn over to our speakers for really the crux of the conversation. I will start with moderated Q&A, and then I will pose questions from our viewers. So please do put your questions into the Q&A box. As many of us were following the mass protest movements leading up to the vote on Monday, the coalition did pass the first piece of legislation in their judicial overhaul plan under what has been called the salami approach, taking piece by piece of legislation. We have all been following the plans, this coalition's plans for judicial overhaul and their pivoting in strategy. And so this was the first piece of legislation that was passed. I would say in US terms, I've heard this bill that was passed essentially being referred to as a constitutional amendment for a country without a constitution, as a change to one of Israel's basic laws relating to the judiciary. It will limit the Supreme Court's oversight of government actions and policies and end the court's ability to strike down government decisions and appointments on the basis of reasonability. And both of our speakers will help us understand exactly what that means practically, what are the tangible impacts that we can expect, what will come next for those that are fighting to stop the government's plans to overhaul Israel's judicial system. We do, of course, expect the protest movement to continue. We have already seen that military reservists and unions have called for strikes. We have learned also about the immediate impact that the passage of this piece of legislation has had on Israel's economy, let alone what has happened already just in the past 6 months. And also, we've been following the reaction in the United States leading up to this and also after. We've heard clear opposition from the Biden administration and many Democratic leaders in Congress, as well as many Jewish organizations, including J Street, of course. We have heard many people calling for a halt to the agenda, calling on Netanyahu to halt his agenda and move towards consensus building to any other potential changes. And so we'll want to touch on what that means and what possibilities and potential there are for negotiations. So over this next hour, we're really going to dive into all of those issues and, of course, trying to understand what impact this has on an issue that all of us at J Street care about, which is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the reality for Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, which is something that we have been following in terms of very harmful actions and pieces of legislation coming out of this coalition. And we want to understand really what we can expect to see in the weeks and months ahead. So before I turn it over to our speakers for the first question, I will just introduce them in a little bit more depth. Noa Landau is the Deputy Editor-in-Chief of Haaretz, Israel's oldest daily newspaper. I'm sure that many of our viewers are subscribers. If you are not, I encourage you to follow Haaretz. They have had excellent reporting about everything that has been going on leading up to where we are today, and even understanding the implications of what is happening every day. Since joining Haaretz in 2009, she served as a reporter, head of a news department, and editor of Haaretz's English edition. She is also the founder of Haaretz 21, which is a project aimed at amplifying stories of Arab and Palestinians in Israel. So Noa, thank you so much for being with us. And Professor Tamar Hostovsky Brandes is a senior lecturer in the College of Law faculty at Ono Academic College. Tamar teaches and researches at the intersection of public international law and constitutional law, which is, as we were just chatting before signing into the Zoom, those two areas of expertise are very much important and relevant at this current state and at this current moment in time. And her work on these issues have been published in leading law reviews and collections. She is also a member of the Law Professors Forum for Democracy, which has been incredibly active during the past half a year. And Tamar, I'd be happy for you to touch on that as well in your remarks. So, first question, is the passage of this bill actually a nail in the coffin to Israel's democracy? And what exactly is the reasonableness standard that essentially has been repealed with the passage of this bill? Why is it so important? And I'll ask you a couple follow-up questions, but let's just start with the basics of what this bill is and the implications that it has for Israeli democracy.
I assume maybe the law professor would like to start with
yes,
what exactly the law says.
Yeah, so the law is basically an amendment to Section 15 of Basic Law, the Judiciary, which is the basic law in Israel that specifies the authority of courts, including the Supreme Court in Israel. And what the amendment basically says is that any court, including the Supreme Court, will not have the authority to pass judgments on the reasonableness of any decision of the cabinet or of ministers or the prime minister, including decisions that are related to matters of appointment. Now, in terms of understanding what this means in practice, basically the change from the current situation, from the existing situation, is the scope of the authority of the Supreme Court to perform judicial review of the government is limited now, more limited now than it was before. In terms of what exactly it implies in practice, its most immediate implication would probably be for matters of appointment. This is, I think, the most crucial point in terms of the immediate applications, tangible implications of the amendment. With respect to other matters, policies of the government, human rights issues, there are other standards available to the courts that could be applied to perform judicial review of those acts. But I think that it's a mistake to focus on the specifics of this particular amendment and of reasonableness, and in understanding the damage or the threat or the implications for, I think, democracy in Israel. We have to look at this piece of legislation in the context in which it was enacted as part of the government plan and on the procedure and manner in which the government approached the enactment of this amendment. And this goes back to the question of consensus building, and I'll pass it on from here to Noa.
So maybe I'll address the first question, which was basically, is Israel's democracy gone? Is it the nail in the coffin of Israel's democracy? So of course it depends. First of all, how do you define democracy, right? Because some people claim that Israel's democracy was flawed to begin with, if we consider, for example, the occupation. But if you think about Israel's democracy and Israel proper, then this is definitely very worrying. It doesn't mean that this is, the last nail in the coffin, just because the government has many nails to put in that coffin in the next session of parliaments. So I would say that the danger is still very much there. So it's not the end. It's just the beginning. Hopefully, maybe, they will be satisfied with this, what they can definitely sell to their political base as a victory. But what they're saying right now, and at least, very senior member of this government are bluntly promising, is that This is just growing their appetite. They actually, one of the ministers, Itamar Ben-Gvir, even said, this is the salad bar before the main meal. It was very poetic. So the danger is definitely there, but it's not the end.
Thanks, Noa. I want to go back, Tamar, to something that you said about human rights issues and other standards. One of the questions that many people are asking in our movement, you mentioned appointments, political appointments would be sort of the first impact. Are there specific actions that can be taken by the government ministers now that this reasonableness standard has been repealed that would impact the lives of Palestinians and the reality for Palestinians in the occupied territory?
I think that's a very good questions, but I think just before that, it's important to put this piece of the puzzle into the big picture. So if we talk about the constitutional overhaul or the judicial overhaul, we're basically talking about an overall reform that the government is pushing, that in which at its whole is aimed at removing all checks from government's power. So there are basically four elements to this plan. One is limiting judicial review of the government. And this first bill belongs to this element of limiting the ability of the Supreme Court to perform judicial review of government. The other part of the second part of the plan is limiting judicial review of legislation, which is a bill that is already on the table, limiting the ability of the Supreme Court to perform that. The third part of the puzzle or the plan is to take over the Supreme Court, take over the committee for the election of judges. So it's both limiting the court and taking over the court. And the fourth part of the plan is to take over the legal advisors. Legal advisors are currently civic employees, but to turn their positions into political posts and to weaken them by determining that their advice is no longer binding, including the Attorney General advice position. Currently, it is binding under Israeli law. Now, each of these elements can have an impact on Palestinians in the occupied territories, because currently each of these, gatekeepers or institutions have authorities regarding Palestinians in the occupied territories. Now, specifically with respect to reasonableness, and I think this is something that's not stressed clearly enough in the debate. The court has other standards which it can, let's even take a step back. The Supreme Court has not done a very good job of protecting Palestinians in the occupied territories as it is today already. So the starting point is not great. However, it does have the authority and sometimes exercises this authority with respect to human rights violations of particular individuals. So even though the Supreme Court has not been very active with respect to overall policies that Israel applies in the OPTs, it does sometimes enact, its authority, intervene with respect to particular and specific acts. Now, one of the grounds on which the Supreme Court intervenes in the occupied territories is Israeli administrative law. Former Chief Justice Barak has this famous saying every Israeli soldier carries within his backpack Israeli administrative law. And as a result, Israeli administrative law is a source, a legal source, which the Supreme Court can exercise when performing judicial review in the occupied territories. This is not trivial because Israeli law doesn't apply in the occupied territories. Nonetheless, the Supreme Court has used administrative law as a source for performing judicial review in the occupied territories. Once reasonableness is taken out of this toolkit, then the toolkit available to the Supreme Court when performing judicial review in the occupied territories is, smaller. There are less tools there. Can it use other tools? Will it be able to use other standards? Yes, there are other tools. Yes, there are other standards. But the importance of reasonableness is not only in those cases in which the court uses it in practice, but in the way legal advisors use it to deter government officials. So if government officials, want to enact certain acts or enact certain policies, and then the legal advisors in their offices says, if this goes to court, it will be struck down as unreasonable. Then within that conversation, the process of making the decision in itself already takes into consideration, what the court will say. once this standards is taken out, theoretically, the court can develop, maybe we're a common law country, the court can develop alternative standards, but that will take time. That legal advisors in government offices lose the ability to tell ministers, this can't be done because the court will strike it down as unreasonable. And I think this is actually a lot more effective than and more important than those cases in which the court at the end applies the standard of reasonableness.
Thank you, Tamar. Really helpful explanation. Noa, I want to ask you if you can touch on some of the other concerns about potential impacts or immediate impacts that Israelis are concerned about seeing now. Who are the groups that are most vocal about those concerns? And also, if you can touch specifically also on the status with the Attorney General right now and what is being discussed around the sensitivity of her position specifically.
Well, as Tamar said, there's the specific law and the wider picture. Regarding the wider picture, you see all sorts of groups protesting because the concerns are very wide, from LGBTQ groups to women's rights to basically any liberal cause, any liberal to progressive cause that people are afraid that this very conservative, very religious, very extreme right government might, of course, harm, and also, of course, regarding Palestinian rights in Israel or in the territories. So these are, although, of course, we can maybe talk about it a bit later, but the Palestinians are not really taking part in the general protest movement, but they do have their own concerns. So this is, regarding the wider picture. Regarding this specific law, what Israelis talk about the most is, of course, government appointments, which is one of the main reasons that the government wanted to push this specific law before the recess, is because they want to use that to kosherize Aryeh Deri back into the government. So, but it's not only about him, it's about all sorts of appointments that they can make without the reasonableness standard. But there are also other issues that the right wing actually talks about when you ask them why it was so important for them. They, of course, never say it's because we wanted corrupt appointments. They have other reasons. And what they say, for example, always has to do, to some degree, with questions of Jewish versus democratic. For example, they mentioned many times that one of the Supreme Court's decision that had to do with the reasonableness standard was allowing Palestinians in 2018, there was a group of some 110 Palestinians that came to Israel to participate in the joint bereaved family remembrance ceremony in Tel Aviv. Israeli and Palestinians together on Remembrance Day held this joint ceremony. And back then, Avigdor Lieberman was the defense minister, and he didn't allow the families to enter Israel. When the Supreme Court allowed them to enter, they used this standard because they said it was very unreasonable not to allow all of them to enter the country on the basis of them as a group and not checking every individual like they're supposed to do. So this is one example the right wing actually mentions. For them, this is something they would want to prevent. And also they would mention cases that had to do with asylum seekers. So basically anything that has to do with the tension between Jewish values and democratic values, or, you can say majority and minority, they claim that this is the reason they're doing it. So, of course, these groups are also, that will affect them as well.
Thanks, Noa. And I think, just that example about the joint memorial ceremony, the Israeli-Palestinian Memorial Center, I know that many people in our movement watch that virtually or attend that. And this is something that comes up every year, right? In terms of defense ministers blocking Palestinian participants. And it's a really good reminder that that standard has been applied in order to actually allow these family members to attend. And also, you of course mentioned Jewish values. Also, I would say, in terms of our Jewish values, we very much believe in the Jewish values of the democratic Jewish values that help to protect the rights of minorities, of course, but obviously there's different interpretations about what are those core Jewish values. So Tamar, back to you for a question about laying out the different paths ahead of us. What can we see now in terms of options for petitions, right? We know that there have been petitions that have already been submitted to the Supreme Court. So what is the path ahead with those petitions? Is there a power that the Attorney General holds? Is her power in jeopardy as a result of the repeal of this law? And if the Supreme Court, going ahead of myself, but if the Supreme Court does somehow put out a decision to essentially override, where could that lead? Can you lay out the different paths ahead and different scenarios that we might expect to see?
So it's very difficult to know right now. The ink has not yet dried on the law, and the petitions have already been filed to the court. So I know of 4 petitions that have already been filed up to today. There are probably more, probably more that will be filed. And I think the big question is whether the court will indeed invalidate the law. Now, this is a very dramatic question in Israel, and it's a precedent, first and foremost, because we are talking about an amendment to a basic law. So there's a doctrinal question of, invalidating a basic law, which is in Israel translated to whether the legal doctrine that we call the unconstitutional constitutional amendment, and which exists in some countries, is applicable in Israel. And which basically this legal doctrine states, or under this legal doctrine, the court can invalidate an amendment to a constitution under various arguments depending on the state in which the doctrine is applied. Now, Israel doesn't have a full constitution, as we know, but it does have basic laws which function or recognize or function de facto as constitutional norms. And therefore, in our internal constitutional discussion or debate, if the court invalidates this amendment, what it will be doing would be to invalidate a constitutional norm. And that would be a precedent. The court has yet to do so. So that is the first part that should be on the table. Now, in previous cases, the court has already stated that it does perceive itself to have the authority to do so. And there are basically 2 paths in which the court has already laid down as allowing it to invalidate an amendment to a basic law or a basic law. The first is if there was a misuse of the constitute power or of the power to enact a basic law. So this is one path. Basically, if there was an abuse of the constituent power, the court can invalidate the law on the ground of such abuse. The second path relates to the content of the law itself. And the court has already stated in the case concerning basic law Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, that in the extreme situation in which a basic law or an amendment to a basic law violates the core of Israel's identity as a Jewish and democratic state, the court does have the authority to declare the law or the amendment to the law void. Now, as we know, with respect to basic law Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, the court did not exercise this authority. So the court laid down the path, but eventually said that despite all of the problems and the difficulties in the nation state law, it does not violate Israel's core identity as a Jewish and democratic state. So the doctrines are there. Now the big question is whether the court will choose to apply the doctrines available to it in this case, as the first precedent in which it will explicitly invalidate a basic law. Now, it's very difficult, I think, to make predictions with respect to how the court will act in this situation. Personally, I think there are grounds, legal grounds, for striking down the law. That doesn't mean that the court will do so. It depends on, other, legal experts, constitutional experts have other opinion. Our community, as many experts, as many opinions as there are in our, in our legal community. Very, I think, difficult to know. But yes, that's a big question. Now, there's also the possibility that the court will wait for a specific case in which the government will use this amendment or turn to this amendment and then rule on all of it together. So there's the possibility, that if the government, for example, fires the attorney general and then claims that the court does not have the authority to, the court will, to examine, this act, then it will do so. But it's very difficult to make predictions in this moment.
Thanks, Tamar. And specifically the role of the Attorney General at this point in time?
It's a law that passed.
Got it.
Which could be used to fire her.
Right. I was going to say, is there, I mean, that's the speculation. That's what we've been hearing. Is she in jeopardy of losing her job?
She is. She is, because Israeli politicians keep, claiming that one of them said she's the worst enemy of Israel. So of course they threat her every day.
That would make the court's job easier, though, in striking down the amendment.
Right. Strategically, I guess that's a question as to how what benefits. Yeah,
that's not a benefit. There's no upside to that.
Yeah. Okay, going back to this concept of consensus negotiations, this has been something, right, that I've mentioned that specifically we've been hearing from the US administration, right? Don't do anything like this without consensus, right? Go back to the negotiations.
I have to say something about this, Adina. I have to say something about the consensus.
I wanted to ask you to say something about this, so please.
This is like the easiest thing for foreign governments to say, because what can they say? It's as if a domestic issue. It's not a domestic issue, but they have concern about, intervening in domestic issues. So they're trying to just, lean in, like trying to find the easiest thing to say, which sounds something like, can't you all just get along? But consensus is not the most important thing when you look at, illiberal policies or undemocratic policies. If there's a consensus from wall to wall or from sea to sea in Israel about, deporting all Palestinians, is consensus important? Why is consensus important in this issue when you talk about core values of liberalism and democracy? So it's easy for the US to say, can't you just get all along? Please negotiate, find consensus. But it's not about consensus. It's about values.
I could not agree more. So I guess then my question about consensus is, what do we see happening right now politically, in terms of the negotiations, right? And that's where I would take the point of consensus, right? Going back to negotiations, we saw, I think there were those that felt that leading up Monday that there would be some sort of pause and potential return to negotiations. And, where do we find it? And of course, Netanyahu came out right after the law was passed and said, I will freeze, any other legislative actions within this judicial overhaul package for 4 months, which part of that is also the recess of the Knesset, but putting that aside, happy to call on my partners from the opposition to come back to the negotiating table. Is this actually something that you see there being promise in? Could this lead somewhere? Is there real viability within negotiations? Also, one of the things that I've also been reading is the discussion of, elections, would be really the most likely path forward in terms of being able to repeal what was just passed. So on the question of viability of negotiations, what is the conversation politically right now in that vein? And also on the stability of the coalition, what would it take for us to get back to elections that could potentially bring about a new government? So 2 questions about the state of play of Israeli politics.
So regarding the negotiations, I mean, I think the best scenario, the most optimistic scenario is that for some reason, Netanyahu, or at least larger parts of his coalition, would feel like when Knesset comes back, it's best for them to calm down the situation. As I said before, look at what they achieved as some kind of victory. They can sell their political base and then just try to kind of calm the situation down and go back to negotiating with the opposition. And then the best scenario is they will just negotiate forever, because there is no real compromise. There is no real solution, or at least I hope so. And I think most of the protest movement also hopes that no one will compromise on core values of democracy. So I don't really think there's a lot they can compromise about, which means the best scenario is just to talk about it forever. Regarding the elections, I'm not that optimistic about that, because I think, you know, they have no reason to have elections. We see the polls day after day. They're really, I mean, they don't have a lot of support right now, specifically Netanyahu. Gantz is gaining a lot of power in the polls, and you know, this is not a time that's great for them for elections. Maybe there could be a scenario in which for some reason the more far right parts of this coalition will not agree with a decision to proceed to negotiations and not to advance some of the other key components of the so-called reform that they want to do in the judicial system. So that in that case, maybe Smotrich or Itamar Ben-Gvir will threaten, or maybe even one of the ultra-Orthodox parties, because they also care about these reforms, would threaten to somehow leave the government. Then, you know, Gantz might go in or not, but I don't think they have a real incentive to disassemble this government, because this is their dream government. When and with who will Itamar Ben-Gvir ever be minister?
Hopefully no one else.
I want to add something, Adina, here.
Yeah, please.
First, I want to be even more specific than Noa and say human rights are not an internal issue. Okay, the entire the premise of human rights is that the state cannot do whatever it wants within its territory. So this whole idea of, there are women rights involved, there are minority rights involved, almost every freedom of expression is at risk. Almost every human right that we can think of is threatened by this government. So this is not an internal issue to an extent that violation of human rights are not an external issue, and this internal issue, and this is even before, I've said anything about the territories, which obviously are not an internal Israeli issue. Now, in terms of the negotiations, I was part of the labor laws negotiations team at the president's house. The Labor Party withdrew relatively early from the talks on the grounds that they were non-transparent and non-inclusive. And I think that part of the problem when we talk about here is that this is a constitutional crisis that is managed as a political crisis, but it is not what it is. This is not a regular political crisis that you negotiate with a give and take, your political. This is a constitutional crisis. It is something else. And the regular politics cannot resolve this type of crisis, because this is not what's going on in Israel. Now, I think it's important to remember that all of these plans, the judicial overhaul, all of these changes, on the four elements of the judicial overhaul that I mentioned initially, they're a means to an end. They're not an end in itself. The government needs these changes because it wants to pursue very concrete plans, which it cannot pursue under the existing constitutional framework, because the court or the attorney general or the legal advisors will strike down and will not enable it to move forward with its plans. And these are not speculations. All we need to do is to open the coalition agreements, it's there, black and white, and see the plans of this government. And the government has no incentive to compromise or to give up part of the judicial or constitutional overhaul, because it won't be able to go forward with its plans if it wants to do so. Now, each party in this coalition has its own reasons for wanting the judicial overhaul, for needing these constitutional changes. Each party in this coalition has its own agenda that is incompatible with the current constitutional and legal framework. And when we talk about compromises and incentives to compromise, we have to take that into consideration. If the government compromises on parts of the constitutional overhaul, it will also have to compromise on parts of its substantive plan, the things that it wants to achieve, the things that members of the coalitions were promised when they entered Netanyahu's government, right? The ultra-Orthodox were promised that the exemptions for military service will be entrenched. The settlement movement, Smotrich, was promised authority to do whatever he wants, in the civil administration in the territories. So promises were made, and the constitutional overhaul is needed in order to fulfill these promises. This is the context in which all of this has taken place.
It's true, but I would just say that, promises in politics can also break them.
Oh, of course, but you understand, it's not just about giving up parts of the legal changes. I'm an academic, but this is not a faculty seminar about the appropriate balance, between different branches of the governments and checks and balances in a liberal democracy. There's a reason for which this plan is taking place now.
Yeah, so thank you for that, Tamar. And no, I want to pick up on what you just said in terms of promises can be broken, and we know obviously that the current prime minister is very good at breaking his promises to his political partners. So I guess the question that I have, and this is relating to questions that are we have loads of questions in the Q&A, many of which have been answered as we have been talking, but also specifically relating to leverage. What leverage exists? And I want to ask about leverage that exists both within Israel in terms of strategy of the protest movement and politically. Where do you see leverage? And then also internationally. And you very much touched on the frustration around sentiments coming out of the US administration or other lawmakers calling for consensus. So what type of leverage do you think would be effective? What do you see that you would like to see from the United States, from the international community? So leverage both internationally and domestically.
First of all, it's really interesting to see how Israel's center liberal-leaning mainstream now is totally cauterizing international pressure, which, just a second ago was a major taboo in Israel, what, Israelis call speaking abroad, or, washing your dirty laundry abroad, or etc. Tamar, said, she said, well, that this is never really a domestic issue of human rights, specifically, but in Israel, it was always a taboo. So suddenly you see Israelis standing in front of the US embassy, holding a sign, Biden SOS. What does it mean exactly? What do they want Biden to do? And obviously they want Biden to pressure Netanyahu, but how? And suddenly issues like US aid to Israel is put into question, not only by the most far fringe left, but by people who are much more into the political center. So it's interesting to see, on a meta level, how this is influencing the conversation within Israel. I think in terms of domestic leverage, I mean, we saw that the voices of the military reservists are being heard probably more than others, but also specifically the pilots. And by the way, talking about this not being a domestic issue, it's not only because of human rights and big values. It's also because Israeli pilots are America's pilots for many important regional issues. We know, talking about Iran all the time, in the end, the US and Israel are military partners in that. And if the US, sees that there's a major strike within the pilots in the Israeli military, they will, of course, be also concerned. That's also one sort of leverage. And we did see that, that there were conversations with the defense minister, within the US and Israel's defense minister, and I'm sure they also touched the issue. So also in terms of domestic pressure, of course, we have the high-tech community and the financial situation, etc. People are now talking, a lot of people in the protest movement are now talking about some kind of taxation rebellion. I'm not sure where this is going to lead. This is definitely something that we didn't see before. It's also technically kind of hard to do because the tax system in Israel is very different from the US. It's actually your employer that pays the taxes, not you personally. So I don't know how people actually do that. But I do hear more and more people, talking about that option as domestic leverage. And in terms of international leverage, I mean, we saw what country did when they really wanted to put international pressure on the country. Not that it works, all the time. We say that human rights is an international issue, but we see what's going on in Russia and China. It's not always, something that actually works. But we do know that there are other tools to use.
Thanks. Thanks for that, Noa. And we also did, of course, we as J Street issued a statement after the passage of this law, very clearly saying, this is not business as usual. We should not be encouraging a business as usual approach vis-a-vis the U.S.-Israel relationship, which is, of course, very much founded upon that shared value of democracy. So we would, of course, like to see more strong statements of action also from our administration and lawmakers. Tamar, I want to ask you, people are in the chat, asking about other, specific examples. You did lay out for us the 4 different components of the broader judicial overhaul plan in terms of limiting judicial review, the different categories, the judicial review of the government, the judicial review of legislation, taking over the Supreme Court and taking over the legal advisors. What do you see coming down the pipeline, assuming that, negotiations, et cetera, happening forever or don't happen? What are the things that you expect to see coming up in the months ahead when the Knesset comes back in session?
Well, it's not right. We don't have to guess because there's things that are already on the table, past first reading, etc. I think Minister of Justice Yariv Levin said very clearly many, many times that he will not appoint one judge in the current system. Now, he might get fired. I mean, he might just not nominate judges. There are various, ways to interpret it. But I think he's made it very clear that he's not up for appointing judges without changes in the committee for the election of judges. And I think, it's a fair guess that the committee will be next. Taking over the court would be the next priority of this government. Again, with respect to the whole, I wanted to correct you, but I didn't want to jump in when you said Netanyahu said he's going to freeze. I didn't hear any commitment to freezing anything. I wouldn't phrase it at that. I'm not sure that even if such a clear statement would be made, whether or not it would be reliable or credible. But I didn't even hear a clear. What we hear is various statements regarding talks and conversations and attempts to reach consensus without any legal strict commitment. I don't think that this means much. To saying we'll try to reach consensus, but if we don't reach consensus, we'll just enact whatever we want. That's not that. This is meaningless talk. I think that in terms again of where we are right now, there are basically 2 Israels right now, right? There's the Israel in the government, and there's the Israel on the street. And in terms of support or backing up, then those who are outside of Israel have to choose which Israel they support. On whose side are they? Are they on side? And this is a government that has turned against its own citizens. I think it's important to say that it's not that just that the government has moved on with its own plans, but it is constantly engaged in delegitimizing, the protesters, delegitimizing in its opponent. This is part of the populist move. So this is the government, we see police violence escalating in, recent demonstration. This is the government that not only moves forward with its own agenda, but has turned on against its citizens. So in this particular context, I think that it's not just standing up to the government or opposing the Israeli government from the outside that's important, but it's also showing solidarity and supporting the other Israel, the Israelis that are on the street. And if you stand on the side and you haven't chosen, if you don't support the protesters, then you de facto support the government. This is where things are now.
Thanks, Noa. We also have been, very clear as to what it means for us at this moment. Being pro-Israel is really supporting the pro-democracy movement in Israel and supporting the protesters and all that you are doing to maintain Israel's democratic infrastructure. So Noa, I want to shift back to you with a question that one of the questions that I see here in the chat, also touching on where's Bibi's trial in all of this? What is the reality? And what are the state of affairs within his trial? And then also, I know that you said, the stability essentially of this coalition, it seems quite significant. However, there was speculation, I think, over the past half a year about there being potential for fracture within the Likud party. People were hoping that Gallant would be one of those people again in this round of votes, and then he voted in favor of the legislation, saying that it's better for him to be at the wheel. So it seems that he wants to maintain his role as Minister of Defense. But are there any other potential fractures within the Likud party that could open up a window? So two questions relating to state of affairs in Likud, specifically Bibi and other politicians.
In Israeli politics, you can't really be a good prophet because, anything could happen. But as it looks right now, there's not a lot of hope for any kind of fractions within Likud, basically because they're all cowards. They would say, the nastiest things about Netanyahu off the record, on the record, nothing. And you saw that during the vote itself, although some of the Likud ministers wanted to portray themselves as more, statement-like, because not really, they're not liberals, but wanted to portray themselves, maybe liberals in the more, classical interpretation of things. But people like that the protest movement was aiming, like Neil Barkat, Gallant, Edelstein, all these people, they voted for this legislation. So we saw live that you can't really, count on these people. And also, they know that although they all want Bibi gone because they all want to be number one, because that's politics. That's why, they will talk against him off the record. But in the end, they also know that without him, they're nothing. So they will never have the same number of seats like with Netanyahu. So it's a problem. I wouldn't count on Likud and not on internal fractions there, but who knows? We did see that Gideon Saar went elsewhere in the end. So it might happen with someone else. Regarding the question of the trial, so technically the trial is also on recess because the judges just announced their summer vacations. Which is quite amazing because, this trial is never ending. This trial is, tearing the country apart and they have to have their vacations. I mean, I'm for, social rights and everything, but this is quite amazing, I think. And the problem is that right before they went to their vacations, they held this very unusual conversation with the prosecution, in which they basically told them that the part of the case that has to do with the allegations of bribe, the judges feel like they're not strong enough. And it was even more problematic because they added a sentence that, now there's a debate around it, what exactly they said, but basically it sounded like they're saying that they need to rethink that part for the good of the country. Then the judges had another announcement claiming that they meant that, the trial needs to be faster because of the good of the country or whatever. There's a whole debate around what they actually said. But the bottom line is that right before they went into recess, they said things that sounded like the case might not be as strong as the prosecution thinks.
I'm just noting some of the comments in the Q&A, or questions and comments specifically about how long this trial is taking, and how crazy it is that we're still within this situation in which in every webinar
Well, this is the reform that the justice system really needs. The system needs more judges. The system needs to be, there's a ton of reforms that the system actually needs, but the ones that the government is doing is not, doesn't answer that.
Yeah. And another common thread here within the Q&A, is something that I think you both have mentioned earlier on in the conversation, sort of about this, awakening relating to human rights issues, and understanding that here with the judicial overhaul, we are talking about human rights issues both within Green Line Israel, but we're also talking about human rights issues over the Green Line in the occupied West Bank. And the question is, where the protest movement has, succeeded in really a awakening, I would say, of a broad swath of the liberal democratic camp, not an insignificant amount of Israeli citizens have been taken to the streets. Noa, you specifically mentioned, though, of course, the challenge for Palestinian citizens of Israel taking part in these protests. So I would like for you to touch on that, while also reflecting on if, we are seeing more people that are making the connection between how this judicial overhaul does relate to both human rights, in Israel and over the Green Line, and more of an understanding of what's happening. Is there a path forward to maintaining that linkage and the momentum? And how do we do that? How do we continue to make that connection? So both that question, and also as you touch on that, addressing the complexity for Palestinian citizens of Israel.
Tamar, you want to go first?
I'll make it short. First, I think that the demonstrations are indeed very Jewish, very nationalistic demonstration. You saw the pictures, with the flags. Israeli, Palestinian citizens, for various reasons, are active in very small numbers in these demonstrations. And I have to say that I don't see yet that, human rights violation in the occupied territories occupy or concern, the majority of protesters on the streets. However, what I do see happening is impatience with the settlement movements and the settlers. So I think it's an interesting dynamic, because on the one hand, human rights of Palestinians are in no way are at the center of this demonstration at all. I can tell you, for example, that laws, we haven't heard the protest movement opposing, for example, to a bill that's on the table, proposing, to require academic institutions to penalize students for displaying Palestinian flags. So the protest movement has no interest in those bills. Possibly a lot of those involved in the protest movements support those bills, don't see any problems, with any problem with prohibitions on carrying Palestinian flags in campuses. On the other hand, there is an identification of the settlement movements and the settlers themselves as those that are pushing forward the judicial overhaul or the constitutional overhaul, and as those that are responsible for it, as needing it in order to further their own agenda. And I think, for that, there's, I think, more interest in the price that is being paid for the settlement projects. More and more people are doubting whether the price of the settlement project is worth it. And there's maybe an opportunity. I'm saying it very, very carefully, I think.
Thanks, Tamar. No, you want to elaborate on that?
It's not a left-wing progressive camp. It's a center-leaning, liberal-leaning camp. It's, I agree with Tamar. I mean, this is definitely not the center of the demonstration. But on the other hand, I do see more and more people that the whole situation pushes them into talking about issues that they didn't before. So, for example, we mentioned international pressure, and the way that Israelis look at it is changing now. But also, for example, people who are shouting at the police during the demonstration, where were you in Hawara? If in Hawara. And this is something that I don't think we would see before. So it's very complex. So on one hand, you have, and also you have to remember that the protest is many, many, many different groups. So, you have those groups who are more center nationalistic leaning, and they would definitely oppose any mention of the occupation. But on the other hand, you see demonstrations in Jerusalem where the occupation is sometimes in the center of the stage. So it really, it's complex. And I do think there is a momentum to talk more about it and to show how it's connected. And there are many groups that do that. The block against the occupation that goes to all the demonstrations, sometimes the mainstream in those protests will be, upset when they see them with the Palestinian flag, but they're there to remind them that this is also an issue. And, a good example is that only today, yesterday, the Israeli parliament actually approved an expansion of a law called the Admission Committees Law that basically allows more communities to screen applicants and reject those who are unsuitable, which is basically a law that was designed to begin with to sell land to Jews only. And this law, some of the people who actually voted to approve this law are from the opposition. There were only 3 Jewish Knesset members who opposed it, and only 2 of those 3 were from other parties other than the Arab Joint List. So yes, it's very complicated, and we know that the Israeli mainstream does not care about the occupation like they care about democracy for themselves, for Jews. But I think there are groups that are doing whatever they can to remind people that this is part of the issue.
Thanks, Noa. And with just 2 minutes left, I think that we will close on that note. And I will say that I do think that there is, increasing opportunity to make that connection, both within Israel, as you've both noted, and the attention that's being paid to the settler movement. Also, many of our viewers have been asking about the reality on the ground and how we are sliding further or deeper into a one-state reality, and this vision of self-determination for both peoples, democracy for both peoples living in security and peace side by side is slipping from our fingers, and making sure that connection, understanding that is also a threat to Israeli democracy, and who is behind maintaining this deepening of the occupation and deepening of a one-state reality is very much of that settler movement. And this is the same agenda that they have, right, with the judicial overhaul, and continuously making that connection both here, both in Israel is important. As you've noted, Noa, we have a lot of work still to do within Israel about educating the people even on the opposition, and we also, of course, here in the United States have that work cut out for us as well, among American Jewish organizations as well as U.S. lawmakers. So I really thank you both again for your incredible explanations, for really helping us to understand the significance of the moment, the impact of the moment. And I thank you both for everything that you are doing in fighting for Israel's democracy and in fighting for human rights for all people. So thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to, oh, there were so many people on this session that, this is really heartwarming to see. So thanks, to everyone who's actually still interested in our troubles.
Yeah, that this is just to end on this last thing. I'll not to be that person that does who has the last word, but one of the things that Tom Friedman had said recently in his discussion on the podcast, on the Unholy podcast, is what you really needs to concern Israelis and the Israeli government the most is disengagement and a desire to disengage from this issue. And I think that we here at J Street will not disengage. This is something that we all care about so deeply, and clearly there are, as you saw, a lot of people who are right there with you, not disengaging. So thank you all.
Do
Thank
not
you very
take that
much.
for granted.
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for listening.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.